I know many of you saying, what do you mean by love? Because people have so many different understandings of love. What I am talking about is not the powerless, the weak, and the anemic love. No, no, no. I'm talking about be love and implement the demands of justice. Be love and use your power to correct everything that stands against love. The urgency of now is to dig in and create the beloved community by rising up to be love. Let's go forward in this moment and bridge the divides. Let's go forward to create the beloved community. Let's go forward and rise up to be love.
Beloved Community Talks.
Well, welcome and thank you for joining the King Center for this virtual Beloved Community Talks experience. Critical race theory, dismantling misinformation. Now, this is a necessary conversation that requires our attention. So I want you to pay close attention tonight. There is a revolution occurring right before our very eyes, seeking to wipe out the collective truth of our lived history. And we must not sleep through this revolution because it threatens to rob our children of a future of integrity, and it hinders us from truly creating a just, equitable, humane, and peaceful world. Given the current tension and legislation around critical race theory, it is imperative that we become informed about what it really is and the way that fear about it is being utilized to mislead and divide. We believe that it is a necessary conversation for the sake of all of our children. And I want to emphasize that all of our children and their right to an inclusive and equitable education and educational environments, where the facts of our history and its current day manifestations are not excluded and diminished, and where truth prevails. We cannot allow our children's education around this nation's history to be caught up in divisive schemes that have emerged from a backlash to the racial awakening and drive to push for racial equity and inclusion that occurred in our world on the heels of the George Floyd killing. This, as you can imagine, is also a conversation that I personally, as well as the King Center, must have, because my father, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and his words are being invoked in efforts to supposedly ban CRT. Imagine using my father's words for your agenda, but then turning around and banning my father after you have used him. This is the height of hypocrisy. If we're going to ensure clarity that is beyond the morass of all the propaganda, it is essential that we have conversations about CRT that are free from any animosity, don't employ guilt or weaponize truth. Our hope is that this conversation will set the record straight by helping us to dismantle all of the disinformation that is out there so that you and I, you the listener and I, can become more effective advocates for ensuring that no child experiences an education that denies the truth of our collective history and how it influences our present day reality. For we all know that if one does not know their history, then that person is doomed to repeat it. So let's talk about it. And I encourage you right now just to stop and tag at least 10 people. Invite them to join us. Share this broadcast on your social media platforms. tweet your thoughts on tonight about this Beloved Community Talks using the hashtags #BCT on CRT, #BCT on CRT, and also hashtag the King Center. These talks are courageous conversations purposed to yield compassionate, nonviolent action as a pathway to the beloved community. But before we dive in, I want to share my recent thread on Twitter around CRT. And I want you to hear it. I'm going to read this because I don't want to miss anything. It says, my father wasn't assassinated because he said he wanted his children to be judged by the content of their character. He was gunned down because he was courageous and strategically working to dismantle racism, poverty, and militarism. He was speaking truth to power about the Vietnam War, about economic injustice, plus racial injustice, about the other America, about the violence of our U.S. government. Today, people who don't want the truth shared about these things are using one little quote, albeit famous, albeit iconic, from a speech that my father gave about injustice and his dream that we've eradicated injustice. Hear me. That was his dream, that we had already eradicated injustice. And he was a nonviolent warrior. And so that we eradicated it, including racism, to ban honest history under the guise of banning CRT. But banning CRT, which many of who are zealous about banning don't fully understand, isn't actually the goal. Instead, books about freedom and freedom fighters, including my father, who was a nonviolent warrior, are being banned. And teaching on racism is being banned. Truth about the past and the continual fight for justice and freedom is only a threat if a person considers the freedom of others bondage for them. Transparency about how racism and white supremacy have devastated and continue to devastate is necessary for humanity. Misuse of a murdered man who was then among the most hated men in America by white supremacists for talking about and doing something about what many want us to shut up about today, for the benefit of banning even him, is unconscionable. We must teach our children the truth about history and about what we must do now to conquer hate and injustice. We must do that at home, in school, via books and art, etc. Anyone unwilling to do so cannot humanely claim concern for hurting white children as a reason. Black children are human. Brown children are human. Racism is destroying the world that all children live in. I need to repeat that. Racism is destroying the world that all, underlined, bold, and italicized, live in. All children. And if adults are not courageous enough to confront it, what message are we teaching our children? What are we leaving them? What is the legacy that we are leaving them? Finally, what is the intentional focus on CRT distracting those who have fallen prey to the fear-mongering from really focusing on? What's not being corrected when history is not being taught correctly? Today, for this beloved community talk about critical race theory, dismantling disinformation, let me welcome my co-host, who is influencing culture, legislation, and civil rights in her role as Associate Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, which is the first and foremost civil and human rights law firm in the United States of America and America's premier legal organization fighting for racial justice. As a member of LDF's litigation and policy teams, Janae's extensive civil rights law experience includes expertise as a voting rights and election law scholar, as well as testifying before Congress on multiple occasions on such critical matters. She was a Fulbright Scholar at the Legal Resource Center in Accra, Ghana. Janae Nelson has appeared in various media as an expert on race, civil rights, constitutional law, and election law. She recently published Counting Change, Ensuring an Inclusive Census for Communities of Color. I want to welcome now my co-host for this Beloved Community Talks, Janae Nelson.
Hello and good evening, Dr. King. It's an honor to be here with you.
Good evening, and I am so delighted that you are here with me and representing an organization that has meant so much to us in this nation in terms of fighting for racial justice and economic justice. And so thank you for the work that you're doing and the Legal Defense Fund is doing on so many fronts. We really appreciate it. And I just wanted to, just have a brief conversation with you because, when I started hearing my father's name is misused. His words are misappropriated all the time. And when I started hearing about this happening with CRT, of course, my heart was troubled. I never get angry anymore. As I've gotten older, I realize that there's a great deal of ignorance in our world, and that I have a responsibility to help people, to bring them out of that ignorance if I can. If I can't, I've done my part, but I know it's irresponsible to leave people in their ignorance. But when I started hearing about this and everything going on with voting rights, it was just concerning to me. And I thought about his quote that I'm really on a mission to disprove. And he said, the tragedy still of human history is that the children of darkness are often more zealous and determined than the children of light. And I was just thinking, as we look at what's happening with voting rights, as we look at what's happening with CRT, there's some folks being paid, strategizing behind the scenes around all of this. They're working overtime. And I'm concerned that the children of light are not doing the same thing at the same level. So I wanted to get your take on where we are with all this misinformation around CRT in particular.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to address that. And it's very encouraging to hear that you are not angry, because that can eat away at the energy that we need for this fight. But we all need to be alarmed. We all need to be agitated and activated around this issue. This supposed attack on critical race theory is nothing but a red herring to make all of us distracted about a theory that has now been castigated and mischaracterized as something dangerous and divisive, when it is exactly the opposite. When I hear about CRT in the current media and the propaganda that's been spewed about this very impressive theory that was created in the 1980s by faculty of color, a rainbow group of scholars who were trying to find a way to think about injustice in our society and understand how our laws are perpetuating some of the historic discrimination of this country. And they came up with this scholarly theory to guide their work and understanding. When I think about how it's being used as a sword against that very work around equity and inclusion and a celebration of diversity and a pursuit of justice, it is deeply concerning, and it is probably one of the biggest areas of disinformation that has taken hold in recent times. I love the quote that you provided from your father. There's another one that I also love in this context, and that is when he said, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." And I don't think he meant to cast aspersions. I think he meant to say that when we deliberately ignore knowledge, when we deliberately try not to learn our history, that is a very, very dangerous state of mind, not only for an individual, but absolutely for a nation.
Yes, and when we do that, taking advantage of people who have vulnerable minds, that is very dangerous. So let's just dive in. We want to challenge our viewers tonight, but more importantly, we want to enlighten them and elevate them to a place where they can become advocates in this area to ensure that all of our children are receiving an inclusive education and a truthful education, more importantly. So joining us for this conversation are two individuals who are committed to dismantling misinformation around race and racism. One of our guests tonight is one who many might call an expert on CRT. We'll just say he is an expert on CRT. Mr. Kendall Thomas is the Nash Professor of Law and Director of the Studio for Law and Culture at Columbia University, where he has been a member of the faculty since 1984. Wow. He is a scholar of comparative constitutional law and human rights, whose teachings and research interests include law and culture, feminist legal theory, law and sexuality, and critical race theory. His seminal writing on the intersection of race and law appears in Critical Race Theory, the key writings that founded the movement, which he co-edited. And I must also add that Kendall is a professional jazz vocalist. So he will be joining us tonight. Welcome, Kendall. And then we also will be joined by Dr. Jacqueline Batalora. She is someone we have had the pleasure of having as a guest during our in-person Beloved Community Talks before the pandemic. Dr. Batalora is the author of Birth of a White Nation, The Invention of White People, and Its Relevance Today, second edition. She is an attorney and professor of sociology at St. Xavier University in Chicago and a former Chicago police officer. Dr. Batalora is an editor for the Journal of Understanding and Dismantling Privilege. And so we want to welcome both Professor Kendall Thomas and Dr. Jacqueline Batalora. Welcome to both of you, and we're glad to have you on tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to dive in with a question. I mean, Janae kind of started us off, and I just want to get you all's perspective too, because we want to ensure that people have clarity on tonight around CRT. There's a lot of misinformation, as we would agree. And so for both of you, in my father's nonviolent philosophy, there are 6 steps, and the first 2 are information gathering and education. And tonight, as a part of that process, we want to deal with the misinformation on critical race theory and make sure people have the right information, that they are educated on the night, and that they're able to educate others. And so I want each of you to just share with me, or both of you, what is critical race theory? What is it?
I'm happy to jump in. I'm teaching a social theory course now. And so I always think it's great to just start with what the heck theory is, because most everyday folks don't necessarily have a grasp of that. Theory is generally a framework for making sense of social phenomenon. And there's all kinds of theories that we learn about. And so critical race theory then is a set of principles in law formulated to account for social inequality on the basis of race. And so that's my sociologist perspective on CRT, and I'll turn it over to the lawyer.
Thank you very much. I suppose it would be best for me to start not with the definition, but with the story, because I remember quite vividly the intellectual awakening that I had when I read in 1980 or 81 an article by the late Derek Bell, whom many credit, I certainly do, as birthing what would come to be known as critical race theory. It was an article about a case that every law student reads, Brown versus the Board of Education, a Supreme Court decision that was decided in 1954 that struck down separate but equal public school education. That is, compulsory race-based segregation in public schools. But the problem of Brown, like the problem of the legislation that followed in the wake of Brown, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and other signal legislation, is that it kind of opened up the chasm. It revealed the gap between formal legal equality, the law on the books, which guaranteed people of color equal legal rights, and the continuing economic and social and political inequality that is with us today. And so critical race theory really was an effort to address the racial literacy deficit, the absence of a theoretical language, as my colleague was saying, that could help us make sense of this practice where you have the law saying that everybody is equal, and yet being content with entrenched inequality, and in some important respects, actually being complicit in reproducing inequality. So it's this basic contradiction between the law on the books and the rights granted by law on the books and the absence of that in fact.
So now clarify for our listeners, now that you have stated what it is, because everybody has stated what it is, where is it really taught? Yeah, I think you said it's clear. It's taught in the context of law schools?
Principally, well, originally it was a body of legal scholarship. So I read it in law school. And in fact, I read it in law school only after I had taken basic courses in constitutional law, criminal law, civil procedure, and all the bread and butter courses that we call black letter law. And at Columbia University, where I teach, critical race theory is a course that is offered to students in their second and third year of law school. So these are students who have spent 4 years in college. Many of them, before they come to law school, have done graduate work in other disciplines. So we're talking about a body of academic writing, of legal scholarship, and now scholarship in other fields that typically people are introduced to well into their adulthood after they have spent 12 or more years learning lots of other things. So the notion that critical race theory is being taught or has ever been taught in elementary schools is just well, am I allowed to say lie?
Yes.
Absolutely.
It is
Absolutely.
certainly factually incorrect.
Yes. You know,
I'm
and
sure there are many other things that can be said too.
I didn't even have the option of taking critical race studies in law school. I was just lucky enough to stumble upon Patricia Williams' Alchemy of Race and Rights, and then the Fighting Words compilation with Kimberly Crenshaw and Charles Lawrence, Mari Matsuda. And so that was, you can go all the way through law school and never even touch upon critical race theory.
Can I interject there just for one moment? I graduated from Emory Law School and never touched upon it.
Yeah. So you're lucky if you're at a law school where you get to take a solid critical race theory course. And I can just say with regard to an undergraduate education is that we require students at the 300 level, so by the time they're juniors or seniors, to take a social theory course. And within social theory, they are expected to learn about critical race theory. Why? Because it is a theoretical tool, a framework to help our students make sense of the social phenomenon we are living, such as the disparate experience often that transpire with law enforcement dependent upon the race a person is. How can you make sense of those sorts of patterns in society that we see without something as helpful as critical race theory?
So if I can jump in, thank you both for that definition of critical race theory. And if you are watching this, I hope you're also taking notes and creating your own bibliography from the excellent scholars that Professor Thomas and Professor Batalora have cited as some of the preeminent critical race theorists. But based on what you two just shared, I want to underscore two things. One is that CRT, critical race theory, is a sophisticated framework, a theory, as Professor Batalora explained, for understanding law and policy and society. As such, it is highly improbable that it is being taught in any elementary schools, any middle schools, any high schools, and I think you both just established it's even a scarce course in some law schools and certainly even in undergraduate institutions. But what I want to say is that's not because it's harmful in any way. It's not because critical race theory is somehow a bad thing to put before children or to put before undergrads. And I think that is so important because we often say, no, it's not being taught there. And it lends the suggestion that perhaps it's inappropriate or it's bad. And it's not being taught in those settings in K through 12 because it's just a more sophisticated theory. It's just not appropriate from an educational standpoint to be taught at that level. It's because it's a rigorous educational theory that's aimed at graduate students and law students in particular, not because it's harmful. So I really want to make sure we make that point. And the second is that critical race theory has benefited our ability to understand the role of race in present day inequities, as both of you have made very clear. And it also allows us to be able to confront those inequities. So it has value. It's an important tool of learning and understanding that compels action. So my question is then, if CRT is not being taught in the K through 12 setting, what type of learning and information do the laws that are proliferating across the country in the name of CRT, what are those laws trying to ban? If it's not about actual critical race theory, then what is the agenda?
Well, I can try to answer that question. I think that these laws that are now, I think, in force in at least 12 states in the United States are scapegoating critical race theory for purposes that have nothing to do with critical race theory. There are at least two things, it seems to me, that these laws are trying to do. First, they're just trying to shut down any conversation of any kind about race. I live in Brooklyn, and many years ago, I was invited by my godson's kindergarten teacher to come during the month of February to read a book to the kindergarten students and to tell them a little bit about my life as a law professor. So I found a book about the 1955 Montgomery bus boycotts that centered the story of Rosa Parks. And because, as Dr. King noted, I am a singer, I taught them a song that went, if you see me at the back of the bus, at the front of the bus, if you see me at the front of back of the bus, you can't find me nowhere. Come on up to the front of the bus. I'll be riding up there. So you have these 30 children, 5, 6 years old, singing this song with great joy. And it was a way to teach them in a way that was accessible to them, our common history. And what these laws want to do is shut down reading books, singing songs that in any way touch on race. So these laws are gag rule laws. Let's understand them. A lot of the folks who are opposed to critical race theory talk about being opposed to wokeness or to cancel culture. But these are gag rule laws that are scapegoating CRT to shut down a discussion of race. The second thing that these laws are trying to do is to distract Americans from the massive hits that public education budgets have taken in the last 10 years. We've seen in this country a chronic disinvestment in kindergarten through 12 public school education. In the state of Georgia, where Dr. King is, the State Board of Education passed a resolution, I believe it was last summer, condemning critical race theory. That same year, almost $1 billion were cut from the Georgia public school budget, with a massive loss of jobs in the field of education and educational harms to young people who attend school in the state of Georgia. So it's a distraction and it's a diversion from what I like to call a politics of compulsory illiteracy, whose goal is to keep the American people, in Donald Trump's phrase, poorly educated, because a poorly educated populace cannot understand the ways in which the laws and policies of this country have been structurally positioned to disadvantage not just people of color, but poor and working class white Americans. And critical race theory is certainly also about impeding the emergence that we started to see really last in the summer of 2020 of a multiracial, intergenerational social justice movement that was connecting the dots between racial and economic injustice. I think that's what the people who oppose critical race theory are terrified of, that people will see that we cannot have economic and social justice in this country without racial justice, that the two things are closely bound together. So it's about the politicization and the weaponization of knowledge to perpetuate illiteracy and to maintain the status quo of increasing inequality in the United States that we've seen over the past 25, 30 years.
Oh, thank you for that, Professor Thomas. That was just so profound. And I want to pause for a moment and encourage the viewing audience to tweet and post what you are hearing. You've heard some gems here about CRT and about the truth of what this enterprise is. So I encourage you to share this broadcast and also to use the hashtags, hashtag BCT, Beloved Community Talks, BCT on CRT, hashtag BCT on CRT, and hashtag the King Center. Dr. Batalora, I don't know if you wanted to say something about that.
Sure. Well, I think it's really important. I hope for viewers at this point, there should be no doubt that what is going on right now with regard to this legislation, that so-called anti-CRT legislation, it's not about critical race theory. It's absolutely not about that. So then we have to ask ourselves, what is it about? And so I just want to piggyback on all of the gems that Professor Thomas offered to also point the ways in which I wonder if people who are viewing have seen some of the clips of school board meetings where you have white women in tears saying, "You will not give my child critical race theory," and invoking this fragile white child and white female, which of course has a rich, deep history in the racial formation of this nation. And so I'd like to take a second to address that, because I think it suggests things that are such a significant distortion of the truth. So if in the name of excluding, really what I think is happening is a modern day book burning, right? So the exclusion of all these texts that are amazing, wonderful, important resources, historical documents, many of them. And so if we are saying to our white children that knowing historical truth is damaging to you, what does that mean about white people? I mean, think about that. What are we saying? That my white children are only okay if we lie to them, lie by exclusion? I reject that version of whiteness. There is nothing healthy about that for white children, and of course not for children of color. Deny what the anti-CRT, and I hate even calling it that because I feel like I'm giving it legitimacy, but this movement to exclude pieces of U.S. history, this is how I would describe it. I shared this with my students earlier today. To me, it's like, let's say on a Friday night, my daughter says, I say to my child, what are you doing tonight? It's Friday night. And my child says, well, Mom, I'm going to go to my best friend Derek's house and we're just going to hang out. What's really happening is that my child is going to Derek's house to hang out, and 200 other people are going to Derek's house to hang out. And there's a bunch of kegs and various pharmaceuticals. Now, did my child lie to me? Mm-hmm. Did my child tell me the truth? Far from it, right? So we are allowing this version of events that are going to keep our children from being equipped with the knowledge they need, regardless of their race, the knowledge they need to understand the world we all live in, and secondarily, in order to confront the problems, the social problems of their time. How do you deny them the history to make sense of it and then tell them go fix it? They will not succeed.
Yeah, that's true. I think Janae mentioned earlier some of the dark money that's involved in these attacks on critical race theory, such as 1776 Action, a group that's led by former Housing and Urban Development Secretary Ben Carson, the Heritage Foundation, which is bankrolled by the Koch brothers, the Concord Foundation, also known as the Judicial Crisis Network, which has put millions of dollars into stacking the federal courts with right-wing judges. These groups are opposed to voting rights. They're opposed to public education. They're opposed to what remains of the social safety net in this country, and they are opposed to democracy. So I always come back to Brown, which, however flawed, had some insights that I think we need not to lose sight of. And there's a moment in the opinion in Brown where Chief Justice Earl Warren, writing for the court, said that one reason Jim Crow public school education violates the Constitution is because education is the very foundation of citizenship. And one of the things that the Black Freedom Movement recognized was that democracy and the full citizenship of African Americans could not be achieved without literacy. I mean, that goes all the way back to Reconstruction. And the counter-revolution that is being waged today, I think, can only be understood in that large historical frame. And we need, as a people, to look to the example of the Black Reconstruction generation if we are going to be able to fight back this racial illiteracy movement, because that's what it is. I've stopped using the words critical race theory in this context because I think it obscures our understanding of what is really going on. This is an attack on democracy that is weaponizing illiteracy to create scenes like the public school board meetings where you have parents crying terrorized by the specter of something that they don't even understand, right? And that is a tragedy for our democracy. So for me, the question is, how are you going to have a gag rule on discussions of race and racism historically in this country and the legacies of race and racism that we live with today, and equip our young people to be effective citizens in a democracy that is going to be made up of people from literally from all over the globe? America today is a complex, multiracial, multi-ethnic society. And what does it mean to be a democracy? What does it mean to be a citizen in this democracy today? With if you're handicapped and disabled from understanding how to live with and across social difference, that, it seems to me, is what hangs in the balance here. And I think critical race theory is an effort really to continue the unfinished project of democracy in this country that generations of African Americans and their allies have waged since the very foundation of our republic. And it's motivated by love. It is a love of knowledge-based movement. So I am totally down with Dr. King's call to be love. And to create spaces of philosophia, love of knowledge, love of the knowledge that can empower us to continue the work of the generations that came before us to make this a more perfect union.
So let's push that a little bit more, since you touched on it, because I think we've done a good job of identifying what it is, where it's taught, some of the harmful outcomes from this illiteracy and misinformation. I think about all of this noise around CRT, and how do we push through it? How do we elevate the knowledge base, the consciousness of people who are not a part of the agenda, but may be taken advantage of by the agenda?
Yes.
Because I think that's the first step. And so how do we combat it without being combative?
Yeah.
Because I think that's part of the issue in our society today. We get to these tough places and it's very combative, and we never break through to a place where we really address the root issue.
Dr. Batalora, would you like to?
Sure. Well, I think that again, focusing attention on the need to know the history of this country, and I frequently try to express that February is Black History Month, but Black History Month is white people's history too. It's American history, and as such, it is also the history of white people. And so, if white children as well as non-white children are to have the tools that equip them for this global society that Professor Thomas articulated, we have to have the historical understanding. We have to have the tools for critiquing, all of which come from knowing our history, understanding the roles that different groups have played, not to promote guilt on the part of white people, but understanding on the part of all people, so that we can confront the challenges that we face together. And so it is so mind-blowing to me that anyone would propose hiding information as a legitimate path forward for our children. And so naming that, I would encourage people to attend our school board meetings and make a declaration for claiming knowledge, and name the fact that this anti-democracy movement is in fact trying to deny our children foundational information required for their success. So I think naming what's going on is a powerful response that doesn't have to be done in a combative way, but that can function to successfully combat. And I think not allowing those white tears, I think there is a significant role for white people to stand up in the face of those white tears on behalf of the anti-democracy movement, to say, no, that this is not what is best for our children. It does not lead us on a path toward a loving community that I certainly want to be part of. So I think naming it and claiming a different way is could be a really useful approach.
I want to make a case here for tough love. James Baldwin, in Notes of a Native Son, memorably wrote that because he loved America more than any country, he reserved his right, he insisted on his right to criticize her perpetually. And I think the Black Reconstruction generation and their progeny, their heirs, and I include myself, of course, among their descendants. My grandfather's grandfather was a freed slave. So I'm connected to that history. And I think the tough love that got them through slavery, that got them through Jim Crow segregation, and that led them to wage a battle for educational equity is a resource that we can all draw on. It doesn't just belong to African Americans. Your father, in a speech in 1962 at Cornell College in Iowa, talked about the success that African American people had in what he called the steady decline of crippling illiteracy. And W.B. Du Bois points out in Black Reconstruction in America that the public school as we know it is largely the creation of the American Negro. And our love of knowledge, our love of this country, I think offers a vision for a true patriotic education, right? The right wing talks a lot about, under the banner of the 1776 Project, patriotic education. But we need to claim the mantle of patriotic education unapologetically, unabashedly, in the name of the Black Reconstruction generation that had the vision to found some of the first public schools in the South, and which spread all over this country. We need to know our history. We need to draw on the strength of that history to animate and empower a love movement, right? That is committed to love of knowledge and to love of this country, and a recognition that if we censor classroom discussions about the meaning of race and the continuing challenges of racism, we are not going to be able to prepare young Americans for the responsibilities of democratic citizenship in our increasingly diverse multicultural society. And I think that will resonate with people. You begin conversations. What does it mean to be a citizen in a democracy? Mm-hmm. What do you need to equip yourself to really make a contribution to our union? And those conversations, those which aren't conversations in the first instance about race, I think are urgently important at a time when 50% of Americans can't read a book at an 8th grade level, and where 1 in 6 Americans drop out of high school. 43% of the Americans in this country who read below a 5th grade level live in poverty. So we have urgent challenges around literacy, around democratic literacy, and racial literacy, I think, can be a bridge between those two things.
So, Professor Thomas, I want to circle back to some of the points you made earlier and how they link up with this. You talked a lot about Brown versus Board of Education, and I'm so glad you did. That is the seminal case of the Legal Defense Fund that ended, as you said, compulsory segregation in our public schools. And one of the linchpins to that case was demonstrating through sociology how Black children were so deeply scarred and self-loathing even as a result of segregation, that when they were faced with the doll test administered by Kenneth and Mamie Clark out of Columbia University, where you are now, and they were given the option of a Black doll and a white doll, a Black doll looking just like them and a white doll looking like their oppressor. They chose the white doll. And that particular aspect of the experiment got a lot of attention. But what didn't get a lot of attention was the detrimental effect of segregation on white children.
Exactly.
And what Dr. King said was the false sense of superiority. And Dr. Batalora, I think you said this so poignantly, that you reject that construction of whiteness being so fragile and so predicated upon a false history, a false sense of self, a false sense of superiority in order to exist. That we've got to believe that white persons in this country are stronger, more resilient, and better than that, right? But have they been given the opportunity? And we see that same cycle today. And we also know that in the interest and perpetuation of racism, we will sacrifice democratic ideals. We will sacrifice an equitable and inclusive education, a rigorous education, one that will help us analyze and process and be competitors in a global market. We're willing to throw that all away in order to preserve white supremacy. So what I think we need to continue to emphasize is what those costs are for all of us, for Black children, for white children, for the future of our society and democracy, as you all have said. And one other aspect of this that I'm hoping you all can talk about, and I'm eager to see what the audience is saying about this. But there is another aspect of this, and it is the empathy, the social, emotional intelligence that comes with being able to relate to the harm that has been visited upon other groups, the ability to be able to look at others suffering and have compassion. So the idea that my white child might feel guilt or shame or distress, and to think that that feeling is somehow negative and not a reflection of their own humanity is where we are going so wrong. And so I'm very eager to understand how you might make sense of that. This idea that we are really discounting the ability of our children to not only handle that, but to be able to demonstrate their humanity by relating to one another. And I'm also eager, as I said, to see what the audience is saying. I can only imagine that there are some very interesting comments to share, and I'll come back to them after you answer that.
You know what? I speak regularly on the invention of white people in law. For the first roughly 100 years after the planting of Virginia, if you look at the legal record, you won't find a single reference to anyone called a white person, even though people who have as little melanin as I were the majority of people who constituted the colonists at that time. And so when I share with groups as young as 7th and 8th graders this history about the invention of white people, and how that invention was used to separate the masses from themselves, people who lived daily life similarly, whether from Africa or from England. But with the invention of white people, that was transformed. And the society was made radically unequal. And so when I share this information, the students are not traumatized. It's the parents. And I want to say to listeners that I get that, because I could have been that parent. I was lucky enough, again, to have stumbled upon Patricia Williams and Kimberly Crenshaw and those writings, and introduced me to a way of thinking and struggling with the social inequality on the basis of race that I saw all around me, right? When I was a police officer, I was an integral part of this nation's response to crack addiction that plagued disproportionately African-American communities in our cities, right? That I was a part of a response enacted by people in positions of power who exhibited no empathy for people suffering from addiction. And yet we know when we jump ahead to 2000s and there's another addiction crisis, but this time the drug is opioids, and this time the communities suffering are disproportionately economically advantaged white communities. We're not responding the same way. We're not saying incarcerate, please flood my tax dollars into the militarization of the police, please flood my tax dollars into the construction of prisons. That's not our response, because we see white people as human beings. That empathy piece is such a significant part of this distorted history that most of us get in our K through 12 education with regard to U.S. history. And in order to repair our humanity, having a robust version of U.S. history, it is a tonic for healing. It is capable of helping us heal from these other forces in society that very much push white people in particular to a place of a diminished empathy toward communities that are not white.
So there's a question that we have here. What we're talking about now takes us in a whole nother realm. Because when I think about it, I think about the history of trauma in America, period, and how we have not dealt with trauma over and over again in this country. And as a result, we are moving people to a place where it's like we move on. We're not in touch with our own pain. When you're not in touch with your own pain, it's kind of hard to sense the pain of others. And so, golly, this can take us in a whole nother direction. But there's a question here from Jennifer Roberts, who said, how do we get more white people to the table to have these uncomfortable but important conversations? Because and I just want to add this to a question, because most times when we're having these kind of conversations, it's the choir singing to the choir.
Yes.
You know, and we've not been as successful as expanding the conversation, reframing discussion in a way that those who are outside of it feel like they can come in. So how do we do that? How do we get our white brothers and sisters to have these uncomfortable but important conversations? What are the things we need to do to disarm people so that they don't feel? Because I think I can imagine some of it is probably that fragility that we talk about so often, and not want to be under attack, or feel like you're under attack or blamed or whatever.
Sure.
But nonetheless, it's essential, because if we keep talking to the same crowds, we're not going to transform.
I think that probably one of the most crucial pieces to the success of bringing more white people to that table is to make sure we are approaching where we started this entire event this evening, and that is with love. Right? When we are not coming from a place of love, people feel that we're all intuitive with each other. And so number one, and I'm still working on that one. I'm in a significant way, to how do I approach that? Because I'm an educator. So I think, okay, well, let's get some facts, and here's some data, and here's some history. And we need all that too. and to approach people with love and with the understanding, like something I try to say repeatedly when I lecture or when I'm in a classroom, and that is like, I didn't make this society. I didn't put these laws and policies and practices in place that produced this inequality that we're living in the midst of. I didn't do it, but I was born into a society that was structured in that way so that that inequality persists. We're all born into that society. And so for me, that approaching this as a sociologist, much like as a lawyer, really helps to create that wide angle lens and take some of that personal defensiveness away. Now, does that mean that I don't have a personal obligation, a moral obligation, because of how I am positioned within that society that I didn't structure? Of course, absolutely. And do I have both opportunities and challenges in light of that racial positioning? Absolutely. But I think it's really important to stress that, you know, none of us chose to be born into this society that is just steeped in structures that systematically position white people above all others.
Can I share a story real quick? And it's not my story. It's a story that I heard on one of our beloved community talks. I think it was during our summit this past January, during the King holiday. A young lady shared. There was a Black young woman in the state of Mississippi who was on a campaign to have the flag at the Capitol, state Capitol, removed. She started receiving a lot of threatening emails. And one of the emails she received, though, was from a white gentleman who knew her for several years and was concerned about her safety, but said, you know, I disagree with your campaign, but I'm concerned about your safety. She proceeded to invite him to her home and to have a conversation. And in that conversation, she started, this is a white man, Black woman. She started the conversation around the flag with, what does that flag mean to you? And it disarmed him and caused him eventually to ask, well, what does it mean to you? Mm-hmm. And through that kind of conversation, it began to get elevated to a place where through time, he began to appreciate her more than the flag. Mm-hmm. Now, was there an immediate change with him? No, but there were some important seeds planted, because a year later, he had a flag at his home that he took down, and he started joining her in those efforts. And we know the rest of the history around, because this is a real story. We know the rest of the history around the flag in Mississippi. I do. When you talk about love, I just want people to understand, because I know Professor Thomas talked earlier about tough love. It does not deny truth, but it's the approach in the conversation that gets people, that gets their defenses down, so that you can connect to them in their humanity, so that truth can then be elevated, because we know there's power in truth. Truth does not, regardless of what is happening right now with truth, truth is so powerful, as my father said, in the end, it's going to triumph. And I can't remember the person who said, truth crushed the earth will rise again. Mm-hmm. Truth can stand powerfully on its own if it continues to be spoken and it continues to be pushed forward, instead of anything else, like attacking a person, you know, their character, or insulting them. And so it was that conversation that enabled that particular white man to become a part of the journey to deal with something that was very racially harming and difficult for a community. So I wanted to share that. I don't know if there are any other questions. I don't see any at this point from the audience. But I want to ask us, because I know there are a lot of people listening. They're individuals. Some may be attached to organizations. But what are some practical steps that people can take so that we can begin to turn the tide in this area? You know, what is one practical thing that an individual can do? I was talking to Janae earlier, and I said that the force of this is so great that it's really going to take something along the lines of what happened with my father's movement. It's going to take massive organization and mobilization to combat all of this misinformation and to address what is now law, as you said, in some of our states in terms of challenging it. You know, Daddy talked about just and unjust laws. These are, to me, these are unjust laws. And he gave us, you know, a blueprint for how you deal with unjust laws. There comes a time when you have to disobey unjust laws. And sometimes there has to be massive civil disobedience. So what do you all think are some practical steps that the ordinary listener on here today can do?
Well, I think that the first thing that I would say is that different people have to do different things.
Right.
So Dr. Batalora was talking earlier about whiteness and white fragility. Those are terms that I don't really use. But one idea that I really like a lot from the critical race theorist Barbara Flagg is the idea of white racial transparency, a term that she coined to capture a social fact about most white Americans, namely that most white Americans, most of the time, are not in situations where they have to think about the fact that they're white. Right?
That's true.
And so I think that I have friends, white friends, who have quite intentionally created conversation circles in which they come together as people of goodwill, committed to a vision of not just a non-racist America, but an anti-racist America. Right? And engage in conversations where they are from a place of empathy about questions like, what does that flag mean to you? What does it mean to be American citizen? I mean, I think we need conversation circles. I spoke a few weeks ago with my dear friend, Janet Dewart Bell, who is the widow of Derek Bell, to a group called the Global Citizen Circle. And this is a group of people all over the world who are part of an intentional community committed to an ethics of open, difficult conversations about our common future. So I think that people should attend local school board meetings because all politics is local, right? A lot of the legislation, such as the legislation in Oklahoma, against which a lawsuit was filed a few weeks ago by the American Civil Liberties Union, took as its template Executive Order 13950, which former President Trump issued, which current President Biden rescinded. And the states that are adopting these laws at the state and local level, I think, should be challenged. And so as citizens, we have a right to attend sessions of our state legislatures, sessions of our city council, sessions of our local school boards, and to do so out of a love of democracy. Your father famously said, I quoted this in an article that I wrote many years ago, that the law cannot make a man love me, but at least it can keep him from lynching me. So the love I'm talking about isn't necessarily interpersonal love. It's a love for our democracy and a love for the idea of an American future in which all of our children will be able to live out the full meaning of the American creed. So that's that love of our country I think, reflected in the question, what does the flag mean to you, could be the kernel for a series of conversations in our churches, in our mosques, in our synagogues, in our civic clubs, in our social clubs, that can revive the spirit, for example, of the freedom schools, right? Because we're living at a moment, quite frankly, and I don't think we say this often enough, we're living at a moment in which our democracy is in crisis, right? And the urgency of that challenge, I think, really demands of us all, right, to claim our civic identity and our political responsibility as citizens. White people who are alive today are not responsible for the entrenched institutional and structural racism that damages the lives of so many people of color as well as white people. But
Yes.
we are all, regardless of our race or color, accountable
Yes,
for addressing it and undoing the institutions and structures that have created this crisis across so many dimensions. I've named it a literacy crisis, but it's also a legitimacy crisis. There are too many people in this country today who have a fundamental distrust in our democratic institutions and in the value of engaging as democratic citizens with our institutions. We cannot responsibly stay silent in the face of that. I was a member of an organization called ACT UP many years ago, whose slogan was silence equals death. And I think silence around this assault on racial literacy, on civic literacy, may well lead to the death of our democracy. The assault on literacy, the purging of knowledge. Toni Morrison reminded us many years ago that fascism is fundamentally about a purge politics. And this purge politics that is trying to remove books, magnificent books like Beloved, from our school libraries and curricula, is, it seems to me, an urgent question, not just about education and literacy, but about democracy. And learning communities can be formed anywhere. We don't need to be in school to do that. We can form learning communities wherever we are. So I would urge the practice of talking and conversation as a way to build trust, which can then open up space for taking on some of these more difficult issues.
And Dr. Batalora, I want to ask it more specifically to you. What can people who are listening and viewing this, what can they do to protect themselves from the continuing propaganda and misinformation, the steps that they can take? Because it's very easy to leave this conversation and end up in some other conversations where you get drawn back into this whole misinformation cycle. How do we protect ourselves on a day-to-day basis to ensure that we're staying focused in truth and on truth?
Well, I think that we have to go back where we started in our talk together, which is remembering what critical race theory is, a set of principles in law formulated to account for social inequality on the basis of race. And so it's a very simple explanation. And as long as we know that this effort that is we're coming in through our TV screens, at our school board meetings and these other places, that what it is being called is not what it is.
Right.
And I think when we keep that clarity, then we know that what Professor Thomas is articulating is in fact what's really going on, which is an anti-democracy movement. And so if we can hold that clarity, I know what CRT is. This is not it. So clearly this is a tool I would hope that people are really not pleased, to put it nicely, at the trickery that is the primary tool for this project, right? If it's not CRT, and we know that, but that's what it's being housed in, that's the name for this bucket, you are trying to be tricked. So my hope is that after this talk, we can go forward with some clarity, understanding that it's not critical race theory. We know what that is. So what is going on? And it's this anti-democracy effort. And how does that effort serve you, your children, your grandchildren, your community, your sense of a loving, beloved community? Is that anti-democracy effort, does that serve you? I don't think so. I don't think it equips us for that global community that our children will be workers within. It does not develop our humanity, our healing for the traumas of this country's history, the healing of our humanity, that the ways in which so many people have articulated whiteness has shaped people's humanity, ability to experience empathy. All of that is healing that needs to come about. And if we're going to be part of that effort, we need to have the kind of clarity that I hope this conversation has helped to illuminate.
Thank you all so much. I think we're out of time now, so I want to thank you, Dr. Batalora and Professor Thomas, for your insight and your inspiration on tonight. And I do hope that the people who are viewing are able to take these jewels that have been shared on tonight and become a part of the force that will help to combat what's happening now with the attack on our democracy. Because you're so right, Professor Thomas. These are all about our democracy and trying to undermine that. My daddy used to talk about SCLC's work of saving the soul of America. And when I look at what's happening with voting rights and I look what's happening with CRT, it literally now is trying to take out the soul of America. And we all have a responsibility. As you said, every one of us, regardless of how we got here, yes. We all have a responsibility and accountable to make sure that this democracy is delivered intact the way it's supposed to be to the next generation.
Exactly.
So, thank you so much for being with us on tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you so much.
And we will see each other again, I'm sure.
I certainly hope so.
Yes.
Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Janae,
that was a great.
You've been over there writing and listening and everything else.
Oh,
so
that was
what are your closing comments on all of this?
Well, I do want to leave people with a charge. And yes. I think that there are a number of ways. And one of the best points was that we each have a role to play. We can get involved in some way. First and foremost, we need to stop calling this anti-CRT and call it anti-truth, which is what it is. It's anti-truth. It's anti-democratic. It's anti-literacy. We've heard so many other ways to explain this. And diagnose what this is. And everyone's not coming at this with the same agenda. There are those who are simply uninformed and frankly ignorant and who have bought into the propaganda unwittingly. And for those individuals, we need to educate them. We need to explain that this is not in their interest, that this is harmful to us as a country, harmful to us as a democracy. Those are the people you can bring to the table and have an honest conversation like the beautiful one that you shared about the flag. For others, we need to expose them. We need to expose what this agenda is in fact about. They very well know what CRT is and what it isn't. And they are trying to sell us something that is untruthful, that is a lie, that is disinformation. And when we see that happening, we have to expose that and name it and point to the actors who are behind that. We should also be showing up at these school board meetings. We should be saying that we want a culturally responsive, inclusive education. We want equity in resources, that we should not be worried about whether people are teaching some theory that's not even occurring in the curriculum. We should be caring about what the scores look like, what the grades are like, what our faculty diversity is like, what resources our children have, the actual quality of education that we are receiving in our public funded education system. In addition, please educate yourself on the laws of your state. You can go to our website, naacpldf.org. You can look up on AAPF, which is the African American Policy Forum.org, a hashtag Truth Be Told, which is a campaign that the Legal Defense Fund is part of to try to emphasize that truth must be told if we are trying to advance as a society. And you can see the map of different states and the different laws that have been passed and the ones that are pending. And you should know what they are in your state. And if laws haven't passed yet, please challenge them. And if they have, then we need to make that challenge even more aggressive. The fact of the matter is, if we care about our democracy, if we care about our future, each one of us has to get involved in this fight to preserve truth, to preserve knowledge, and to preserve what is ultimately our freedom of thought, lest we find ourselves in a society in which education and knowledge is truly used as a weapon against all of us.
Yes. And may we all wake up before it's too late.
Amen.
Yes, because these are revolutionary times in so many different ways. So Janae, thank you and the Legal Defense Fund for all the wonderful work that you do and those that work with you. I really appreciate you on tonight. And I want to thank all of our listeners, our viewers, on tonight. This was a very powerful, informative, and very necessary conversation. And I want to leave us with something because at the King Center, our vision is about the beloved community where injustice ceases and love prevails. And we heard a lot about love tonight. And the love that we're talking about is a love for humanity. It's a love for the genuine aspect of another human being. It's unconditional. It's the total outpouring of oneself for the benefit of the good of everyone. And so when we think about that, I want to tell you about the 6 principles of nonviolence as we leave here, thinking about the best way to address what is happening right now in our democracy, because it is an attack against our democracy, everything that's happening. And regardless of who's doing it, this is not about the who. Yes, it's important that we know the who so that we can strategize appropriately, but in nonviolence, we never seek to defeat people. We always seek to defeat injustice. That's one of the principles of nonviolence. We always seek to win friendship and understanding in nonviolence. Nonviolence always takes courage. It's not passive. It doesn't sit back and lay down and say, well, just let things be. No, it takes courageous stances, but it does it in a way, again, that it doesn't seek to defeat people, but seek to defeat injustice. Nonviolence willingly, and it's a willingness. It's a willingness to undertake suffering and sacrifice for a greater cause. We call that a willingness to undertake suffering, unearned suffering, knowing that it is redemptive. And finally, we choose love as that weapon, as that means, as that way. We ensure that the outcome we're trying to achieve of a just, equitable, inclusive, a peaceful and humane educational system, a country, nation, our means must be consistent with that. So we have to have just means to get to just ends. And then finally, as we do this work, know that the universe And those of you who are spiritual and use this word, know that God is on the side of what's right and what's just. And if we continue to press forward and work zealously and determined more than the children of darkness, that there will be an intersection of our work with the power and the force of the universe to change and transform things. And so don't give up, don't ever give up hope. Don't ever stop the work. Even if you have to pause and take a sanity break, don't ever stop the intention of moving towards the beloved community. Because at the end of the day, that is what I believe most people want in this world. And so again, thank you for joining us. Thank Dr. Jacqueline Batalora, Professor Kendall Thomas, and my co-host, Janae Nelson. I encourage you to take nonviolent action, as I said, regarding something that you heard, and to connect with strategic, love-centered work towards truth and reconciliation. We cannot get to the beloved community through misinformation. Truth is a necessary ingredient. And that's why we had this conversation now, because we want to dismantle misinformation. From this day forward, just because somebody calls something something doesn't mean you have to adopt that. Do the information gathering so that you can call it what it is. This is anti-truth. This is anti-democracy. It's not anti-CRT, because that's the guise, that's the smoke screen. And so I encourage you to study my father's nonviolent philosophy and methodology with the King Center. You can register for our nonviolence training series at thekingcenter.org. And of course, I invite you to join us in our Be Love campaign. You can learn more about that and take the Be Love pledge and register for our virtual series at thekingcenter.org. Because we must be loved in every area of our lives, including in truth-telling, education, and how we apply lessons learned from history and present injustices to eradicate racism. As you see on the screen now, November 15th, 16th, and 18th, or next week, we have a special Nonviolence 365 virtual experience, Activate You College Edition. This is specifically for college students. Other people can attend, but the target of this training is college and university students. And so please go to the King Center and register for that training. And finally, we hope this has been helpful, but we want you to share your thoughts with us about tonight's conversation by using the QR code on the screen. Use that QR code that you're seeing right now on the screen to complete a short survey. We also want you to ask all to help dismantle misinformation by hosting your own conversation. You heard about that earlier from Professor Kendall. Your own conversations or community of learning on CRT or anti-truth or anti-democracy. And you can simply go to the King Center website and click the link about that, hosting your own conversation. And I'm going to close with something that my father said. He said, among all the moral imperatives of our time, we are challenged to work all over the world with unshakable determination to wipe out the last vestiges of racism. In spite of what they may try to ban, stay woke, stay engaged, and be loved. Take care, be safe, and I wish you all the best.